Hello guys, welcome to Ben 10 What If. So in this video, we will see what if Ben 10 was in the Demon Slayer universe. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1, Worlds Collide. The flash of green light faded as Ben Tennyson slammed into the dirt road, his back aching from the impact. He groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows and spitting out dust. "Stupid Chronosapien tech," he muttered, running a hand through his brown hair. "Paradox warned me about messing with those time devices. Just moments ago, or maybe it was hours or even days, time travel made everything confusing. Ben had been fighting an alien smuggler near Bellwood. The guy had some kind of interdimensional portal generator that interfered with the Omnitrix. One explosion later, and here he was, wherever here was. Ben stood up, brushing dirt off his green jacket. The familiar weight of the Omnitrix was still on his wrist, at least that hadn't changed. But everything else definitely had. Instead of the city streets he'd been fighting on, Ben found himself on a dirt path cutting through thick forest. The air smelled different, cleaner, with none of the car exhaust he was used to. And it was quiet, except for birds and the rustle of leaves. "Okay, focus, Tennyson," he said to himself. "First rule of being lost, find civilization." The path had to lead somewhere. Ben picked a direction and started walking, keeping his eyes peeled for any signs of people or technology. The sun was low in the sky, maybe an hour before sunset. After 20 minutes of walking, the forest thinned, revealing what looked like a small village in the distance. The buildings were old. Like, really old. Wooden structures with paper doors and tiled roofs. "Either I'm in some historical theme park," Ben said, squinting at the settlement, "or the where isn't as big a problem as the when." As Ben approached the village, he noticed something else strange. The people were dressed in clothing he'd only seen in historical films. Men in simple kimono-style garments and women in layered robes moved about, carrying buckets and baskets. No cars, no power lines, no smartphones. Just oil lamps being lit as dusk approached. An elderly man sweeping outside a shop looked up as Ben passed, his eyes widening at Ben's jeans, jacket, and sneakers. Hey," Ben said with an awkward wave. "Could you tell me where I am? And, what year it is?" The man stared at him, then replied in what Ben recognized as Japanese. "Great," Ben sighed. "Language barrier. Should have figured." He continued into the village, aware of the stares his modern clothing was attracting. Children pointed and whispered. A woman hurried her daughter inside as Ben passed. "Friendly place," Ben muttered. His stomach growled loudly. "And I'm starving." Hopefully alien tech translates into whatever currency they use here. A small restaurant with lanterns hanging outside caught his attention. Delicious smells wafted from inside, and Ben's stomach responded with another growl. He slid the door open and stepped inside, finding a simple room with low tables and cushions on the floor. The conversation stopped as everyone turned to stare at the strange foreigner. Ben smiled awkwardly and pointed to a steaming pot at another table. "That. I'd like that, please," he said, pantomiming eating. The owner, a middle-aged woman with her hair tied up, looked him over suspiciously but nodded and gestured for him to sit. Ben sat cross-legged at an empty table, relieved at being accommodated despite his strange appearance. The food, a simple but delicious stew with rice, arrived quickly. Ben tried to mimic how others were eating, clumsily handling the chopsticks. When it came time to pay, he realized his problem. "I don't suppose you take credit cards?" he asked, miming swiping a card. The owner's blank expression answered his question. "How about American dollars?" He pulled out a 20 from his pocket. The woman examined the bill with confusion, then shook her head. "Great," Ben sighed. He held up his hands apologetically, trying to communicate that he couldn't pay. The owner's expression hardened, and she began speaking rapidly in Japanese. her tone clearly angry. Other patrons were watching now, some standing up with unfriendly expressions. "Whoa, calm down," Ben said, backing toward the door. "I'm not trying to," a man grabbed his arm, speaking harshly. Ben yanked his arm free, holding up his hands. "I don't want trouble," he said, reaching for the Omnitrix under his sleeve. "But I'm not looking to get pummeled over dinner either." The door slid open behind him, and a boy's voice spoke in Japanese. Ben turned to see a teenager about his age with dark red hair and a scar on his forehead. The boy wore a checkered haori over a black uniform, and, strangest of all, carried a sword at his side. The newcomer spoke again, this time pulling out some coins and offering them to the restaurant owner. The tension in the room immediately dissipated. "Thanks," Ben said as they stepped outside together. "You really saved me back there." The boy smiled, saying something in Japanese that Ben couldn't understand. He pointed to himself. "Tanjiro. Tanjiro Kamado. Ben. Ben Tennyson," Ben replied, tapping his chest. "Wish we could actually talk." Tanjiro spoke again, gesturing to Ben's unusual clothes with curiosity. As they walked, Tanjiro seemed to be asking questions, pointing at Ben's jacket, his watch, his sneakers. Ben tried his best to communicate through gestures, but the language barrier was frustrating. When they reached the edge of the village, Ben figured it was time to part ways. "Thanks again for the help," he said, gesturing back toward the restaurant and mimicking paying. "I owe you one." Tanjiro smiled and nodded, but then his expression suddenly shifted. He tilted his head, as if listening for something, then his eyes widened in alarm. He grabbed Ben's arm, pointing urgently toward the forest and speaking rapidly. "What is it?" Ben asked, tensing up. "Trouble?" As if answering his question, a scream echoed from the village behind them. Tanjiro immediately turned and sprinted back, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. Ben hesitated only a second before following. They rounded a corner to see a scene of chaos, villagers running in terror as a hulking figure tore through a building's wall. The creature looked humanoid but was easily 7 feet tall with grayish skin and elongated limbs. Its eyes glowed red in the dusk light, and its mouth, filled with razor-sharp teeth, was stretched in a nightmarish grin. "What the hell is that?" Ben gasped. The creature's head snapped toward them, nostrils flaring. It spoke in Japanese, its voice a guttural growl that sent chills down Ben's spine. It didn't take a translator to recognize the malice in its tone. Tanjiro stepped forward, his stance shifting as he gripped his sword. He called out something that sounded like a challenge. The monster laughed and charged, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. Tanjiro met its charge, his sword flashing in the fading light. Ben watched in amazement as the teenager executed a series of precise slashes, ducking and weaving around the monster's attacks. But the creature was strong. It caught Tanjiro with a backhand that sent him flying into a cart, splintering the wood. "That's my cue," Ben said, activating the Omnitrix. The familiar green holographic display popped up, showing silhouettes of his alien forms. He quickly selected one and slammed the dial down. Green light flashed, and where Ben had stood was now a 9-foot-tall, red, four-armed alien. "For arms," he shouted in his deeper, resonant voice. The villagers who hadn't fled screamed at the appearance of a second monster. Even Tanjiro, picking himself up from the destroyed cart, stared in shock. The gray-skinned creature turned toward Four Arms, its red eyes widening in surprise. It snarled something in Japanese. "Sorry, still don't speak the language," Four Arms replied, cracking his knuckles. "But I'm pretty sure it's hero time translates in any world." Four Arms charged, meeting the creature head-on. His first punch sent it staggering backward. The monster recovered quickly and slashed at him with elongated claws that Four Arms hadn't noticed before. He caught its wrist with one hand and delivered a powerful uppercut with another, launching the creature into the air. To his surprise, the monster twisted in mid-air and landed on its feet on the side of a building, defying gravity. It grinned down at him, then launched itself like a projectile. Four arms caught it, but the impact drove him backward, his feet digging furrows in the dirt road. The creature was stronger than it looked, and fast. It bit down on one of his shoulders, and four arms roared in pain. "Get off me," he shouted, grabbing the monster's head with two hands and prying its jaws open. As they struggled, Tanjiro appeared in four arms' peripheral vision, sword raised. The boy's eyes now focused not on four arms but on the monster's neck. With a shout, Tanjiro slashed, his blade catching the light as it swept toward the creature's throat. The monster sensed the attack and released four arms, leaping away just as the sword sliced through the air where its neck had been. Four arms rubbed his injured shoulder. "Thanks," he said to Tanjiro, who was staring at him with a mixture of caution and amazement. The monster crouched on a rooftop, hissing at them. Its wound from four arms' punch was already healing, faster than any normal recovery. "Okay, regenerative abilities," four arms noted. "Good to know." Tanjiro called out, pointing to the creature's neck and then making a slicing motion with his hand. "The neck?" Four arms asked, mimicking the gesture. "That's its weak point." Tanjiro nodded enthusiastically. "Got it," four arms said, crouching. "Let's coordinate. You go left, I go right." Though Tanjiro couldn't understand the words, he seemed to grasp the intent. He nodded again, shifting his stance. They moved simultaneously, Tanjiro darting left, four arms charging right. The creature snarled, momentarily caught between targets before leaping at Tanjiro, perhaps seeing the human as the easier prey. That was its mistake. As it pounced toward Tanjiro, the boy executed a perfect dodge, spinning on his heel. The monster's momentum carried it past him, directly into four arms' waiting grasp. "Gotcha!" Four arms shouted, seizing the creature with all four arms. He held it immobile, straining against its incredible strength. "Now, Tanjiro." Tanjiro didn't need the prompt. He was already moving, his sword flashing in a precise arc. The blade sliced cleanly through the monster's neck, separating head from body. Four arms expected blood, but instead, the creature dissolved into ash, crumbling away in his hands until nothing remained. "Whoa," Four Arms said, staring at the empty space where the monster had been. "That's new." A beeping from the Omnitrix symbol on his shoulder warned him that the transformation was timing out. In a flash of green light, Four Arms reverted to Ben. Tanjiro stared at him, sword still drawn, eyes wide with shock. "Yeah," Ben said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I get that a lot." Slowly, Tanjiro lowered his sword. He said something in Japanese, his tone questioning. "I'm not like that thing," Ben said, gesturing to where the creature had disintegrated. "I'm human. This," he held up the Omnitrix, "lets me transform." Tanjiro stepped closer, examining the Omnitrix with intense curiosity. He spoke again, this time pointing at Ben's chest, then his own, then making a gesture that encompassed the village. "You want to know if I'm here to help?" Ben guessed. "Yeah, I am. Though I'm also kinda lost." Their attempt at communication was interrupted by more screams from the far end of the village. Tanjiro's head snapped up, and he immediately took off running. Ben followed without hesitation. They found two more creatures, similar to the first but smaller, cornering villagers against a storehouse. Tanjiro didn't wait. He charged in, his sword a blur of motion as he engaged the first monster. "Time for round 2, Ben said, activating the Omnitrix again. This time he selected a different alien and slammed down the dial. The green light faded to reveal a velociraptor-like alien with wheels for feet and a helmet-like head. "XLR-8, he announced, then zoomed into action. Moving faster than the human I could track, XLR-8 snatched villagers out of danger, depositing them safely at the village edge before the monsters could even react. With the civilians clear, he turned his attention to the second creature while Tanjiro handled the first. XLR-8 circled the monster, creating a blue blur that confused it. The creature slashed wildly, hitting nothing but air as XLR-8 weaved around its attacks. Each time he passed, XLR-8 struck the monster with his clawed hands, opening cuts that began to heal almost immediately. Tanjiro! XLR-8 called, remembering their earlier tactic. The neck. Despite the language barrier, Tanjiro understood. As he finished off the first monster with a clean decapitation, he turned toward XLR-8's opponent. XLR-8 changed tactics, no longer circling but charging straight at the creature. At the last second, he dropped into a baseball slide between its legs, catching its ankles with his tail and yanking. The monster fell forward, and XLR-8 pounced on its back, pinning it down. Now, he shouted. Tanjiro's blade flashed, and the second monster dissolved to ash just like the first. The village was quiet now except for the distant sounds of frightened villagers. XLR-8 transformed back to Ben, the Omnitrix timing out again. What were those things? Ben asked, knowing Tanjiro couldn't answer but needing to voice the question anyway. Tanjiro replied in Japanese, making a motion like fangs with his fingers, then pointing to the night sky that was now fully dark. Night creatures? Monsters? Ben guessed. Some kind of vampires? Tanjiro shook his head at vampires, though Ben wasn't sure if he understood the word or was reacting to Ben's tone. He said something else, this time putting his hands together as if praying, then pretending to sleep, then making the Fang gesture again. They attack people at night while they're sleeping? Ben tried. Tanjiro nodded vigorously. And you hunt them, Ben continued, miming Tanjiro's sword technique. You're some kind of monster hunter. Another nod, this one accompanied by a serious expression. Tanjiro pointed to the uniform he wore, then made a wide gesture as if to indicate there were more people like him. You're part of a group, Ben realized. An organization that fights these things. Tanjiro confirmed this with a smile, then his expression grew curious again. He pointed to the Omnitrix, then to Ben, raising his eyebrows in question. It's a long story, Ben said with a sigh. And I'm not sure how to tell it without words. Their makeshift conversation was interrupted by the approach of villagers. Instead of gratitude, their expressions showed fear, not just of the creatures that had attacked, but of Ben and Tanjiro as well. An older man, perhaps the village elder, spoke angrily, gesturing for them to leave. Guess we overstayed our welcome, Ben said. Tanjiro replied to the elder respectfully but firmly. Whatever he said didn't change the villagers' minds. More people gathered, some holding farming tools like makeshift weapons. I think that's our cue to exit, Ben said, tugging Tanjiro's sleeve and nodding toward the forest path. Tanjiro reluctantly nodded, and they backed away from the crowd before turning to walk quickly down the path. Once they were out of sight of the village, Tanjiro stopped and looked at Ben with a serious expression. He pointed back toward the village, shook his head, then pointed deeper into the forest and nodded. You want me to come with you? Ben asked. Tanjiro nodded, then held up 3 fingers. He made gestures that seemed to represent different people. There are 3 more people with you. Ben guessed. Another nod, followed by a smile. Tanjiro started walking, occasionally glancing back to make sure Ben was following. Ben hesitated only briefly. He was lost in what appeared to be ancient Japan, with no way to communicate and monsters roaming around. Following the guy who could fight those monsters and had already saved him once seemed like the smart play. All right, Ben said, jogging to catch up. Lead the way. They traveled for nearly an hour through the darkening forest. Tanjiro moved confidently, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or listen. Ben was reminded of Wildmutt's sensory abilities. Tanjiro seemed to have heightened senses even in human form. Finally, they reached a small clearing where a modest cabin stood. Smoke rose from its chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Tanjiro called out as they approached. The door slid open, and a small figure bolted out with inhuman speed, crossing the clearing in a blur before tackling Tanjiro in what appeared to be a hug. Ben stared in surprise. The figure was a girl with pale skin and pink-tinted eyes. She wore a flowered robe and, most strikingly, had a bamboo muzzle covering the lower half of her face. Despite the strange appearance, her joyful reaction to Tanjiro was unmistakably that of a sibling. "You must be one of the three," Ben said. The girl turned to look at him, tilting her head curiously. Tanjiro said something to her, gesturing to Ben and then making a transformation motion with his hands. The girl's eyes widened. "Ben, this is Nezuko," Tanjiro said, surprising Ben by speaking his name. "My sister." "Nice to meet you, Nezuko," Ben replied with a wave. Two more figures emerged from the cabin, a blonde boy in the same uniform as Tanjiro and a bare-chested young man wearing a boar's head mask. They stopped short at the sight of Ben, and the boar-masked boy immediately dropped into an aggressive stance. Tanjiro quickly stepped between them, speaking rapidly in Japanese. The blonde boy responded with what sounded like panic, while the boar-masked guy snorted dismissively. "I'm guessing they're not rolling out the welcome mat," Ben muttered. The argument continued until Nezuko tugged on the blonde boy's sleeve and nodded encouragingly toward Ben. This seemed to calm him slightly, though he still looked nervous. Finally, Tanjiro turned to Ben and gestured for him to follow him into the cabin. The others watched warily as they entered. Inside was simple but comfortable, a fire pit in the center, bedrolls along the walls, and a small table with cushions. Tanjiro sat down and motioned for Ben to join him. The others filtered in, the boar-masked guy keeping his distance while the blonde boy hovered anxiously near the door. Nezuko sat close to Tanjiro, watching Ben with bright, curious eyes. Tanjiro pointed to each person in turn. "Zenitsu," he said, indicating the blonde boy, who jumped slightly at being named. "Inosuke," he continued, pointing to the boar mask. "And Nezuko," he finished, smiling at his sister. "I'm Ben," Ben replied, tapping his chest. "Ben Tennyson." Tanjiro nodded, then pointed to Ben's wrist, clearly asking about the Omnitrix. Ben held up his wrist, displaying the device. "The Omnitrix," he said slowly. "Omnitrix," Tanjiro repeated carefully. Ben nodded, then made a transformation gesture with his other hand. "It lets me transform into different aliens, different beings." Tanjiro's brow furrowed at aliens, but he seemed to understand the concept of transformation. He said something to the others, who reacted with varying degrees of skepticism. Inosuke snorted and said something that sounded challenging. He pointed to Ben, then to himself, making a fighting gesture. "I think he wants to see proof," Ben said. "Or maybe he wants to fight me. Either way, I can show you, but not in here. Too small." He stood up and walked toward the door, gesturing for them to follow. Outside in the clearing, with plenty of space, Ben activated the Omnitrix again. The others watched with fascination as Ben scrolled through the alien silhouettes. He selected one and pressed down the dial. Green light flashed, and in Ben's place stood a blue moth-like alien with 4 wings and large green eyes. "Big Chill," he announced in his raspy voice. Zenitsu screamed and fell backwards. Inosuke grabbed what appeared to be dual swords from inside the cabin and dropped into a fighting stance. Tanjiro's eyes widened, but he held up a hand to stop Inosuke from attacking. Nezuko, surprisingly, showed no fear. She approached Big Chill with open curiosity. "It's still me," Big Chill said, though they couldn't understand his words. To demonstrate his abilities, Big Chill exhaled a freezing breath that created a small ice sculpture in the shape of the Omnitrix symbol. Then he turned intangible and phased through a nearby tree before becoming solid again on the other side. Tanjiro approached cautiously, touching the ice sculpture with amazement. He spoke to Big Chill, his tone questioning. Big Chill tapped the Omnitrix symbol on his chest, then held up his wrist where the device normally sat. Understanding dawned in Tanjiro's eyes. The Omnitrix began beeping, and moments later, Ben stood where Big Chill had been. The transformation back seemed to finally convince Zenitsu that Ben wasn't a threat. He stopped cowering, though he still kept his distance. Inosuke, however, seemed more interested now. He approached Ben, poking him with a finger and sniffing loudly through his mask. "Personal space, dude," Ben said, stepping back. Inosuke said something that sounded like a challenge, then pointed to the Omnitrix again, making a "bring it on" gesture. "I think he wants to fight me," Ben said to Tanjiro. Tanjiro sighed and nodded, saying something to Inosuke that the boar-masked boy ignored. Inosuke continued gesturing challengingly. "Alright," Ben said, activating the Omnitrix again. "Let's give him what he wants." This time, Ben transformed into a small, frog-like alien. "Gray matter," he announced in a high-pitched voice. Inosuke stared down at the tiny alien, then burst into what was unmistakably laughter. He said something that Ben didn't need translated to understand was mocking. Gray matter smirked. "Size isn't everything, boar boy." As Inosuke continued laughing, Gray matter scampered up his leg so quickly that Inosuke didn't notice until the tiny alien was on his shoulder. Gray matter tapped a pressure point on Inosuke's neck, causing the arm on that side to go temporarily numb. Inosuke yelped in surprise, swinging around trying to catch Gray matter, who was already leaping to the ground. The boar-masked boy drew his swords with his good arm, but Gray matter quickly identified weak points in his stance. The tiny alien darted between Inosuke's feet, calculating trajectory and force perfectly. A precise push at the right spot sent Inosuke off balance, stumbling forward and dropping his sword. Before he could recover, Gray matter had climbed his back and pressed another pressure point, causing Inosuke's legs to buckle. The boar-masked boy fell to his knees, unable to stand, his arms still numb. Gray matter hopped down in front of him, bowing dramatically. Tanjiro and Zenitsu stared in astonishment. Nezuko made a sound that might have been a giggle behind her muzzle. The Omnitrix timed out again, and Ben returned to human form, standing over the temporarily paralyzed Inosuke. "The pressure points will wear off in about 2 minutes, Ben explained, though Inosuke couldn't understand him. "No permanent damage." Inosuke growled something that sounded like a mix of frustration and reluctant respect. Tanjiro approached, shaking his head but smiling slightly. He said something to Ben that seemed appreciative of the non-violent takedown. As Inosuke regained control of his limbs, grumbling as he stood up, Tanjiro gestured for everyone to return to the cabin. The mood had shifted, while Zenitsu still seemed nervous. Inosuke now watched Ben with what appeared to be competitive interest rather than hostility. Inside, they sat around the fire pit again. Tanjiro brought out some dried meat and rice balls, offering them to Ben, who accepted gratefully. As they ate, Tanjiro tried to communicate with Ben through drawings in the dirt floor and gestures. Ben gathered that the creatures they'd fought were called demons, and that Tanjiro and his friends were demon slayers, members of an organization dedicated to protecting humans from these night predators. Ben, in turn, tried to explain that he was from another world, or perhaps another time, using the stars and sun to indicate space and time. He wasn't sure how much got through, but Tanjiro seemed to grasp that Ben was far from home and had arrived accidentally. As the night grew late, Tanjiro offered Ben a spare bedroll. Despite the strange circumstances and the language barrier, Ben felt oddly comfortable with these people. They were warriors, like him, fighting to protect others. Ben lay awake for some time, staring at the ceiling and thinking. The Omnitrix had been through dimensional travel before, but always with Paradox's help or Asmitha's intervention. This time, he was on his own. He lifted his wrist, examining the device in the dim firelight. The Omnitrix seemed to be functioning normally, but something felt different about it. The core glowed with its usual green light, but there was a subtle shift in the energy pattern that Ben couldn't quite place. "Guess we'll figure it out tomorrow," he murmured to himself, rolling over to sleep. In his dreams, Ben saw shadows with glowing red eyes and heard a voice, smooth and cold, speaking words he couldn't understand but that filled him with dread. He awoke with a start to find morning light streaming through the cabin windows. Tanjiro was already up, practicing sword techniques outside. Zenitsu still slept, snoring loudly, while Inosuke was nowhere to be seen. Nezuko, Ben remembered Tanjiro trying to explain, slept during the day, something about demons and sunlight. Ben stepped outside, stretching. Tanjiro paused in his practice to nod a greeting. "Morning," Ben said. "So what's the plan for today?" Tanjiro couldn't answer verbally, but he pointed to a nearby hill, then made a walking motion with his fingers, followed by a slashing gesture. "We're traveling somewhere to hunt demons." Ben guessed. Tanjiro nodded, then pointed to Ben's wrist with a questioning look. "The Omnitrix?" Ben held up his wrist. "It's still working, but..." He frowned, noticing that the normally smooth surface of the dial had a faint pattern etched into it, like veins or cracks spreading from the center. "That's new." Tanjiro leaned closer to examine it, his expression concerned. He touched the device gently, then pulled his hand back suddenly, as if shocked. "You felt that too?" Ben asked. Tanjiro nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. He sniffed the Omnitrix, then his eyes widened. He said something urgent in Japanese. "I don't understand," Ben said, shaking his head. Tanjiro thought for a moment, then pointed to one of the veins in his arm, then to the pattern on the Omnitrix, then made a gesture like liquid flowing. "Blood?" Ben guessed. "You think the Omnitrix is absorbing blood?" Tanjiro shook his head, then pointed to the demon ash they had created the previous night, which still dusted the ground near the cabin. "Demon energy?" Ben tried. Tanjiro nodded vigorously. Ben looked at the Omnitrix with new concern. "It's adapting to this world," he muttered. "It's done that before, but never like this." Their conversation was interrupted by Zenitsu emerging from the cabin, yawning loudly. He said something to Tanjiro, who responded by pointing to the sun and making a hurrying gesture. Within an hour, they were all packed and ready to travel, all except Nezuko, who Tanjiro carefully placed in a large wooden box he carried on his back. When Ben looked confused, Tanjiro mimed sleep, then pointed to the sun, then made a burning gesture. "She can't go in the sunlight," Ben realized. "Because she's..." The implication hit him suddenly. Ben glanced at the box, then back at Tanjiro with wide eyes. "Your sister is a demon?" he asked incredulously. Tanjiro's expression grew serious. He nodded, then pointed to Nezuko's box and put a hand over his heart. "But she's different," Ben guessed. "She doesn't hurt people." Tanjiro nodded again, relief evident in his face at Ben's understanding. As they set out, Ben's mind raced with questions. A human-friendly demon? A brother who hunted demons but protected his demon sister? This world was more complicated than it first appeared. They traveled through the forest, occasionally stopping for Tanjiro to check directions or for Zenitsu to complain about something. At least, Ben assumed he was complaining based on his whining tone. Inosuke ranged ahead and around them, sometimes disappearing into the trees for long periods before rejoining the group. By midday, they reached a village larger than the one from the previous night. Here, Tanjiro led them to what appeared to be an inn. The innkeeper greeted Tanjiro with recognition, though she eyed the others, particularly Ben, with suspicion. After some negotiation, they were shown to a room. Tanjiro carefully set down Nezuko's box in a shadowed corner. "What now?" Ben asked. Tanjiro made eating motions, then pointed outside toward the village square. He held up fingers indicating they would leave again when the sun began to set. "Lunch and rest until evening," Ben translated. "Sounds good to me." As they ate in a small restaurant, Tanjiro paying for Ben again, Ben noticed people staring at his strange clothes. He would need to blend in better if they were going to spend time in populated areas. After eating, Tanjiro took Ben to a shop where he purchased a simple kimono and sandals for him. Ben changed, finding the traditional clothing surprisingly comfortable, though he kept his jeans and t-shirt in a pack, along with his sneakers, which he absolutely refused to part with after trying the uncomfortable sandals. "Thanks," Ben said as they left the shop. "I'm guessing we stick out less now." Tanjiro nodded approvingly at Ben's appearance, though he glanced curiously at the pack where Ben had stashed his modern clothing. They returned to the inn to rest until evening. Ben dozed off, still tired from the previous day's excitement and dimensional travel. He was awakened by Tanjiro's hand on his shoulder. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and reds. Zenitsu and Inosuke were already up, the latter impatiently pacing the room. Tanjiro opened Nezuko's box, and the demon girl emerged, stretching like someone waking from a deep sleep. She noticed Ben watching and tilted her head in greeting. "Hey," Ben said with a small wave. Tanjiro spoke to the group, his tone serious. He pointed in various directions, eventually settling on the north end of the village. Zenitsu whined something, but Inosuke cut him off with what sounded like a boast. Nezuko simply nodded, her eyes alert and focused. "I'm guessing we're demon hunting," Ben said. Tanjiro confirmed with a nod, then pointed to the Omnitrix and raised his eyebrows. "Don't worry," Ben said, tapping the device. "I'm ready." They left the inn through the window rather than the door, moving stealthily across rooftops. Ben followed, impressed by the agility of his new companions. Even Zenitsu, despite his apparent cowardice, moved with surprising grace. At the village's edge, Tanjiro paused, lifting his nose to the air. He closed his eyes, concentrating deeply, then pointed decisively toward a grove of trees beyond the last houses. The group moved forward cautiously, Tanjiro in the lead. Ben activated the Omnitrix, scrolling through his aliens but waiting to transform. A scream shattered the twilight calm. Without hesitation, Tanjiro sprinted toward the sound, the others close behind. They burst into a clearing to find a terrifying scene, 3 demons surrounding a group of villagers who had been gathering firewood. The demons were different from those they'd fought before, larger, more humanoid, but with grotesque features. One had multiple eyes across its face, another had arms that split into tentacles, the third had a mouth that stretched from ear to ear filled with needle-like teeth. "Time to go, hero," Ben said, slamming down the Omnitrix dial. Green light flashed, but something was different this time. The transformation felt strange. Power coursed through him as usual, but with an unfamiliar edge to it, like static electricity crawling across his skin. When the light faded, Ben had become Diamond Head, but not quite the Diamond Head he knew. His crystalline body had the usual green coloration, but with red vein-like patterns running throughout. The crystal seemed sharper, more jagged, and pulsed with an inner light that shifted between green and crimson. "Diamond Head," he said uncertainly, examining his altered form. "Or, something new." The demons turned at the flash of light, their attention momentarily diverted from their prey. The multi-eyed one hissed something in Japanese, its gaze fixed on Diamond Head. Tanjiro didn't waste the opening. He charged the tentacle-armed demon, his sword flashing in a complex pattern that Ben couldn't follow. Inosuke engaged the wide-mouthed one, his dual sword spinning and slashing with wild abandon. Zenitsu, surprisingly, stood protectively in front of the villagers while Nezuko helped them retreat. The multi-eyed demon lunged at Diamond Head, moving with unnatural speed. Diamond Head raised his arms, transforming them into bladed weapons as he'd done countless times before. But instead of the usual crystal blades, his arms formed serrated, almost organic-looking edges that glowed with red-green energy. "Whoa," Diamond Head muttered. "That's different." The demon slashed at him with clawed hands, catching Diamond Head across the chest. Normally, such attacks would barely scratch his crystal body, but these claws left deep gouges that leaked a glowing mixture of green energy and what looked disturbingly like blood. "That shouldn't happen," Diamond Head said, backing up in surprise. The demon grinned, saying something in a guttural voice as it advanced. Diamond Head steadied himself, pushing aside his concern to focus on the fight. New powers or not, I'm still a hero, he said, planting his feet. As the demon charged again, Diamond Head discovered another change to his powers. When he attempted to create crystal shards to fire at the demon, what erupted from his hands were crystalline spikes infused with the same red energy that coursed through his body. They flew with greater velocity than his normal projectiles and, when they struck the demon, burned into its flesh like acid. The demon shrieked, staggering back. The wounds from Diamond Head's crystals didn't heal instantly like the injuries from the previous night's battle. Interesting, Diamond Head noted. Whatever the Omnitrix absorbed is affecting my powers. He pressed his advantage, firing more crystal spikes. The demon dodged most of them but couldn't evade them all. Each hit left a burning wound that seemed to resist the creature's regeneration. Across the clearing, Tanjiro was holding his own against the tentacle demon, though the creature's numerous appendages made it difficult to get close enough for a killing blow. Inosuke was in a frenzy, slashing wildly at the wide-mouthed demon but unable to land a decisive strike on its neck. Zenitsu and Nezuko had successfully evacuated the villagers and now returned to join the fight. The multi-eyed demon, wounded and cautious now, circled Diamond Head warily. It said something that sounded like a question, gesturing to the Omnitrix symbol on Diamond Head's chest. "Sorry, still don't speak demon," Diamond Head replied. "But if you're asking about the watch, it's not for sale." The demon's eyes narrowed, and it lunged again, this time targeting the Omnitrix symbol directly. Diamond Head intercepted the attack, catching the demon's wrists in his crystalline hands. The contact created a strange reaction. Where Diamond Head touched the demon's skin, red energy crackled, and the demon's flesh began to crystallize. The creature howled in pain, trying to pull away. Diamond Head, startled by this new ability, held firm. The crystallization spread up the demon's arms toward its torso. "What's happening?" Diamond Head wondered aloud. The demon thrashed frantically but couldn't break free. As the crystallization reached its chest, it screeched something desperate. The other two demons immediately disengaged from their fights and turned toward their companion. The tentacle demon extended its appendages toward Diamond Head, forcing him to release the multi-eyed demon to defend himself. The crystallization stopped spreading but didn't recede. The multi-eyed demon's arms remained partially transformed into the same red-veined crystal as Diamond Head's body. Tanjiro appeared at Diamond Head's side, saying something urgent while pointing to the Omnitrix symbol. "The watch?" Diamond Head asked, glancing down at the symbol. "What about it?" Tanjiro made a transformation gesture, then pointed to his own neck and made a slicing motion. "You want me to change forms?" Diamond Head guessed. "Something better for decapitating?" Tanjiro nodded vigorously. "Worth a try," Diamond Head said, reaching for the Omnitrix symbol. In a flash of green light, Ben transformed into Humungosaur, but like Diamond Head, this form was altered. Red veins pulsed across his dinosaur-like body, and his eyes glowed with the same red-green energy. His normally blunt claws were now razor-sharp, and his teeth had elongated into fangs. "Humungosaur," he roared, his voice deeper and more guttural than usual. The demons actually backed up at the sight of his new form. The partially crystallized one barked an order, and all three began to retreat toward the trees. "Oh no you don't!" Humungosaur shouted, charging forward. He caught the wide-mouthed demon with a sweeping tail strike that sent it flying back toward Inosuke. The boar-masked boy capitalized immediately, his swords finally finding their target as he decapitated the stunned demon. The tentacle demon lashed out desperately, its appendages wrapping around Humungosaur's arms and legs. Instead of struggling, Humungosaur grew larger, another of his standard abilities, but now accompanied by a surge of the red energy that made the demon's tentacles sizzle and retract as if burned. Freed from the restraints, Humungosaur seized the demon in one massive hand. With a roar, he tore off its head with the other. The multi-eyed demon, its arms still partially crystallized, turned to flee. It almost made it to the tree line when a yellow blur shot past Humungosaur. Zenitsu, moving faster than seemed humanly possible, intercepted the demon. There was a flash of steel too quick to follow, and the demon's head separated from its body before both dissolved to ash. As the last demon disintegrated, Humungosaur felt the Omnitrix timing out. The green light washed over him, returning him to human form. Ben staggered slightly, feeling unusually drained. "That was intense," he said, examining his hands. For a moment, he thought he saw red veins pulsing beneath his skin, but they faded as he watched. Tanjiro approached, his expression concerned. He pointed to the Omnitrix, which now glowed with a faint reddish tinge around its edges. "Yeah," Ben said, frowning at the device. "Something's definitely different." Zenitsu rejoined them, speaking rapidly to Tanjiro while casting nervous glances at Ben. Inosuke stood a short distance away, his posture suggesting he was impressed despite himself. Nezuko appeared at Tanjiro's side, her eyes fixed on the Omnitrix with what looked like recognition. She approached Ben slowly, reaching out toward the device. Tanjiro started to stop her, then hesitated, watching carefully instead. Nezuko's fingers hovered over the Omnitrix without touching it. The red glow intensified slightly, and the veins in her hand became more prominent, pulsing in rhythm with the Omnitrix's light. "It's responding to her," Ben realized. "Because she's a demon." Tanjiro said something to Nezuko, who nodded and stepped back. He looked at Ben with an expression that mixed worry and curiosity. Ben wasn't sure how to communicate his own concerns. The Omnitrix had encountered and adapted to many energy types before, but this felt different. The red energy, whatever it was, seemed to be altering his transformations in ways he didn't fully understand. As they made their way back to the village, Ben noticed Tanjiro watching him closely. The young demon slayer clearly had questions that neither of them could articulate across the language barrier. They reached the inn without incident, though villagers scattered at their approach. Word of the demon attack had already spread. In their room, Tanjiro pulled out paper and ink, attempting to communicate through drawings. He drew a simple human figure, then added red veins throughout the body. Next to it, he drew what appeared to be a crescent moon. Demons have this energy in their blood, Ben guessed. Connected to the moon somehow. Tanjiro nodded, then pointed to the Omnitrix and made a drinking motion. "The Omnitrix is absorbing it," Ben confirmed. "Adapting to this world's energy. That's why my transformations are changing." Tanjiro's expression grew serious. He added another figure to his drawing, a man with wavy hair and glowing eyes. He drew lines connecting this figure to the demon he'd drawn earlier. "There's someone controlling the demons?" Ben asked. Tanjiro nodded grimly, then made a gesture across his neck, followed by a wide sweeping motion that encompassed everything. "The big bad," Ben translated. "The one you're all ultimately fighting." Another nod. Tanjiro tapped the drawing of the man, then pointed to the Omnitrix with a worried expression. "You think he'll come after the Omnitrix if he finds out about it," Ben realized. Tanjiro confirmed this with a solemn nod. "Great," Ben sighed. Stranded in another dimension and already on the hit list of the local supervillain. Some things never change. Though Tanjiro couldn't understand the words, he seemed to grasp Ben's sentiment. He placed a reassuring hand on Ben's shoulder, then pointed to himself and the others, making a protective gesture around Ben. "Thanks," Ben said with a small smile. "I appreciate the backup. And hey, same goes for me. Until I find a way home, I'm with you guys all the way." They settled in for the night, with Nezuko taking first watch from the shadows of the room. Ben lay on his bedroll, turning over the day's events in his mind. The Omnitrix's adaptation to demon energy was concerning, but also potentially useful. If his alien forms were becoming effective against demons, that gave them an advantage. But what would happen if the adaptation continued? Would the Omnitrix eventually become more demonic than alien? And what about the mysterious leader of the demons? If he learned about the Omnitrix? Ben's thoughts were interrupted by a subtle vibration from the device. He lifted his wrist to see the Omnitrix's display glowing faintly, cycling through alien silhouettes on its own. This had happened before when the watch was processing new DNA or updating its systems. "What are you doing?" Ben whispered to the device. As if in answer, the display settled on an unfamiliar silhouette, humanoid but with distinctive horn-like protrusions and clawed hands. New transformation? Ben wondered. Or existing alien altered by demon energy? The display flickered back to its normal state before Ben could investigate further. He made a mental note to be cautious next time he transformed. The Omnitrix was changing, adapting to this world in ways he couldn't predict. As sleep finally claimed him, Ben's last thought was that he needed to find a way to communicate better with Tanjiro and the others. If they were going to be fighting together, and possibly facing this world's ultimate evil, they needed to understand each other. Across the village, in a shadowed room untouched by moonlight, a figure stood perfectly still. The woman wore a formal kimono and had an elegant appearance, but her eyes glowed red in the darkness. She spoke quietly to the empty air. "Yes, Lord Muzan. I have confirmed it myself. The strange power appeared again tonight. The boy with the green light." She paused as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. "No, my lord. Not like a breathing style or demon art. Something different, something not of this world." Another pause. "Yes, Lord Muzan. I understand the importance. I will not fail you." The woman bowed deeply to the empty room, then straightened, a cruel smile spreading across her beautiful face. Her fingernails extended into claws as she stared out the window toward the inn where Ben and the demon slayers slept. "Soon," she whispered. "Soon we'll discover your secrets, strange one." Chapter 2, Blood and Stardust. Ben woke to sunlight streaming through paper windows and the sound of swords clashing outside. He rubbed his eyes, noticing Tanjiro and Zenitsu's empty bedrolls. Only Inosuke remained in the room, snoring loudly under a pile of blankets. The Omnitrix felt warm against Ben's skin. He examined it, finding the red veins in its surface more pronounced than yesterday. Whatever demon energy it had absorbed was becoming more integrated with the device. "Might as well see what those two are up to," Ben muttered, slipping into his borrowed kimono. Outside, Tanjiro and Zenitsu practiced sword techniques in the inn's courtyard. Tanjiro moved with precision, each strike flowing naturally into the next. Zenitsu's style seemed completely different, faster, more focused on single devastating strikes rather than combinations. Ben leaned against a wooden post, watching with interest. After several minutes, Tanjiro noticed him and waved, saying something to Zenitsu before approaching. "Morning," Ben said with a nod. "You guys always start the day trying to kill each other." Tanjiro smiled, clearly getting the gist of Ben's joke even without understanding the words. He pointed to Ben's wrist, raising his eyebrows in question. Ben held up the Omnitrix. "Still weird. Still changing." Tanjiro nodded thoughtfully, then gestured for Ben to follow him. They walked to a quiet corner of the courtyard where a small table sat with breakfast, rice, grilled fish, and tea. "Thanks," Ben said, realizing he was starving. He sat down and dug in, appreciating how Tanjiro had thought to save food for him. As they ate, Tanjiro pulled out paper and charcoal again. He drew a map showing their current location, then traced a path leading to what appeared to be a mountain. He pointed to the mountain, then made a house shape with his hands. "We're heading to a base." Ben guessed. "Headquarters?" Tanjiro nodded, then drew a simple butterfly next to the mountain. "Butterfly, mountain?" Ben tried. "Or is butterfly a person?" Tanjiro considered this, then drew a woman's face with the butterfly motif. "A woman called Butterfly," Ben interpreted. "Got it." Tanjiro added more figures around the butterfly woman, stick figures wearing what looked like the same uniform as Tanjiro. "More demon slayers," Ben said. "A whole organization." Tanjiro confirmed with a nod, looking pleased at their improving communication. He hesitated, then drew the Omnitrix, followed by a question mark and the group of demon slayers. "Will I join you guys?" Ben interpreted. "I mean, I'm stuck here for now, so might as well help out, right?" Tanjiro smiled, clearly understanding Ben's meaning if not his exact words. He stood up, gesturing for Ben to follow. They returned to where Zenitsu was still practicing, his strikes creating faint crackling sounds in the air that reminded Ben of electricity. Tanjiro spoke to Zenitsu, who responded with what sounded like nervous questions while glancing repeatedly at Ben. Finally, Zenitsu sighed dramatically and nodded. Tanjiro turned to Ben, holding out his sword hilt first. "You want me to try?" Ben asked, surprised. Tanjiro nodded encouragingly. Ben took the sword carefully, surprised by its weight. The balance was different from anything he'd held before, not that he had much experience with swords outside of his Omnitrix transformations. Tanjiro moved to stand beside him, demonstrating a basic stance. Ben mimicked it as best he could, feeling awkward. "I'm more of a punch things as a giant alien guy than a swordsman," Ben admitted. Despite his reservations, Ben followed along as Tanjiro guided him through a simple sequence of movements. After several clumsy attempts, Ben began to feel the rhythm of the exercise. Inosuke emerged from the inn, watching the impromptu training session with what Ben interpreted as amusement, based on his body language despite the boar mask hiding his face. After about an hour, Ben returned the sword, his arms aching. "Mad respect for you guys," he said, rolling his shoulders. "That's harder than it looks." Tanjiro said something to Zenitsu and Inosuke, then pointed to the sun, making a travel gesture. The others nodded, and they all headed back inside to pack their belongings. Ben noticed Tanjiro carefully securing Nezuko's box on his back. The demon girl was nowhere to be seen, presumably already inside to avoid the sunlight. Within the hour, they were on the road, heading toward the mountain Tanjiro had drawn on his map. Ben estimated they had at least a day's journey ahead of them based on the distance Tanjiro had indicated. As they walked, Zenitsu attempted to communicate with Ben through exaggerated gestures and slow, loud Japanese, as if that would somehow make it understandable. Despite the language barrier, Ben gathered that Zenitsu was explaining something about the different styles of swordsmanship he'd observed that morning. Inosuke, meanwhile, seemed more interested in challenging Ben to random feats of strength and agility, climbing trees faster, jumping farther across a stream, lifting a fallen log. Ben humored him, sometimes using the Omnitrix for particularly ridiculous challenges, which always resulted in Inosuke demanding rematch after rematch. By midday, they reached a crossroads where a small shrine stood. Tanjiro approached it respectfully, clapping his hands and bowing his head briefly. Zenitsu did the same, while Inosuke just snorted dismissively. Ben watched curiously but didn't participate, unsure of the local customs. After they'd rested and eaten a small meal from their provisions, they continued on their journey. The afternoon brought them to more mountainous terrain. The path narrowed and steepened, winding through dense forest. Ben was thankful for his athletic build. Keeping up with these demon slayers would have been impossible for an average person. As the sun began to set, they reached a small clearing near a waterfall. Tanjiro indicated they would camp here for the night, as the mountain estate was still half a day's journey away. While Zenitsu complained about sleeping outdoors, at least, that's what Ben assumed he was doing, Tanjiro opened Nezuko's box. The demon girl emerged, stretching like a cat waking from a long nap. "Hey, Nezuko," Ben greeted with a wave. Nezuko made a small noise of acknowledgement behind her bamboo muzzle, her unusual eyes studying him with the same curiosity as before. Tanjiro spoke to her softly, pointing to the waterfall. Nezuko nodded and bounded off toward it with inhuman grace. "Bath time?" Ben guessed, and Tanjiro nodded with a smile. The boys took turns bathing in the cold waterfall while the others set up camp. When it was Ben's turn, he welcomed the icy water despite the shock to his system. After days of travel, it felt good to be clean again. As he returned to camp, he found Tanjiro teaching Nezuko some of the same sword movements he'd shown Ben that morning. Despite not having a weapon, Nezuko mimicked her brother's motions perfectly, her movements fluid and precise. "She's good," Ben commented as he sat down near the small fire Zenitsu had built. Tanjiro beamed with obvious brotherly pride. He said something to Nezuko, who tilted her head curiously before approaching Ben. She pointed to the Omnitrix, then to herself, making a comparison gesture. "You're wondering about the connection?" Ben asked, holding up his wrist. "Yeah, me too." The Omnitrix glowed faintly as Nezuko drew near, the red veins in its surface pulsing slightly. Nezuko held up her arm beside it, and Ben could see a similar pattern of veins beneath her pale skin, though hers were more pronounced. "Demon blood," Ben said, pointing to her veins, then to the Omnitrix. "The watch is adapting to it somehow." Tanjiro joined them, watching the interaction with interest. He drew a breath pattern in the air, then pointed to Nezuko, then to the Omnitrix. "Breathing?" Ben asked, mimicking the gesture. "Something about breathing techniques and demon power?" Tanjiro nodded eagerly, then demonstrated a breathing pattern, deep, rhythmic inhalations that somehow made the air around him seem to vibrate with energy. "That's how you guys fight," Ben realized. "Some kind of special breathing that gives you power." Tanjiro confirmed this with a nod, then pointed to the Omnitrix again, making a combination gesture with his hands. "You think I could combine that with the Omnitrix?" Ben asked, surprised by the suggestion. "Ha! Never thought of applying a technique like that to my transformations." The conversation was interrupted by a loud snap from the forest. Everyone froze, instantly alert. Tanjiro sniffed the air, his expression shifting from casual to deadly serious in an instant. He whispered something to the others, drawing his sword in a single fluid motion. Zenitsu whimpered but also stood, hand on his sword hilt. Inosuke grabbed both his swords, crouching low in a fighting stance. Nezuko moved protectively closer to Tanjiro. "Demons?" Ben asked quietly, activating the Omnitrix. Tanjiro nodded grimly, pointing to multiple locations around the clearing. They were surrounded. The first attack came from directly above, a shadowy figure dropping from the trees with frightening speed. Inosuke reacted first, leaping up to meet it mid-air, his swords flashing in the firelight. Two more figures burst from the underbrush, one targeting Zenitsu while the other charged Tanjiro and Nezuko. A fourth demon, this one massive and bull-like, crashed through the trees toward Ben. "Time to try something new," Ben said, selecting a transformation and pressing down the dial. Green light flashed, tinged with red. When it faded, Ben had transformed into a new alien, or rather, a new version of a familiar one. "Heat blast," he said, surprised to find himself in this fiery form. But like the previous transformations, this one had changed. The usual flames that covered Heat Blast's body were now tinged with dark crimson, and the magma-like cracks in his rocky skin pulsed with what looked like blood mixed with fire. The bull demon didn't slow its charge. Heat Blast raised his hands instinctively, summoning fire, but what erupted from his palms wasn't his usual flames. These burned darker, hotter, with a strange quality that reminded him of the breathing technique Tanjiro had demonstrated. The bull demon howled as the crimson fire engulfed it, its regenerative ability struggling against this new attack. Heat Blast pressed forward, remembering what he'd learned about Demon's weakness. "Gotta aim for the neck," he muttered, forming a blade of solidified fire around his hand. The bull demon, partially recovered despite the burns covering its body, lowered its horns and charged again. Heat Blast waited until the last second, then leaped, higher than his normal form could jump. As he sailed over the charging demon, he slashed downward with his fire blade. The demon's head separated from its body, both turning to ash before it hit the ground. "That was different," Heat Blast said, examining the crimson flames still dancing around his hand. "Stronger. More focused." Around the clearing, the others were engaged in their own battles. Zenitsu moved like lightning, his sword leaving trails of electricity as he fought what appeared to be a serpentine demon. Inosuke was a whirlwind of wild slashes, driving back a demon with multiple arms. Tanjiro and Nezuko fought side by side against a feminine demon whose hair moved like tentacles. Heat Blast rushed to help Tanjiro, launching a stream of his enhanced fire at the hair demon. The flames caught the demon's hair tentacles, causing her to shriek in pain and recoil. Tanjiro capitalized on the opening, his sword blurring as he executed a perfect strike that severed the demon's head. "Two down," Heat Blast said as the demon dissolved to ash. A shout drew their attention to Zenitsu, who was now pinned against a tree by the serpent demon's coils. Heat Blast moved to help, but Tanjiro was faster, executing a water-like attack that forced the snake demon to release Zenitsu. The blonde swordsman fell to his knees, but instead of cowering as Ben might have expected, his posture changed completely. Zenitsu's head dropped forward as if he'd fallen asleep, but his body rose smoothly. When he moved, it was with blinding speed, electricity crackling around his blade as he struck the serpent demon 6 times in what looked like a single motion. The demon's head and body fell in multiple pieces, all turning to ash. Only Inosuke's opponent remained. The multi-armed demon had proven surprisingly agile, avoiding decapitation despite numerous wounds. As the others turned to help, the demon suddenly disengaged, leaping backward into the trees. "It's running away," Heat Blast observed. Tanjiro nodded grimly, saying something urgent while pointing in the direction the demon had fled. "You think it's reporting back to someone," Heat Blast guessed, understanding the concern. The Omnitrix symbol on his chest began beeping, and moments later, Ben returned to human form. The familiar post-transformation drain felt more pronounced this time, and Ben staggered slightly. Tanjiro steadied him with a concerned expression, saying something questioning while pointing to the Omnitrix. "I'm fine," Ben assured him, though he didn't feel entirely fine. "The transformations are just more intense now." They quickly packed up camp, all understanding the need to move locations after the attack. As they traveled through the dark forest, Ben noticed Tanjiro frequently stopping to smell the air, clearly tracking the escaped demon. After about an hour of careful travel, they reached a small cave hidden behind a waterfall. Tanjiro indicated this would be their shelter for what remained of the night, though he, Inosuke, and Nezuko would take turns keeping watch. As Ben settled against the cave wall, Zenitsu approached and sat beside him. The blonde boy had been oddly quiet since the battle, his usual nervous energy subdued. He said something soft and hesitant, making a sleeping gesture and then a fighting motion. "You're asking if I saw you fight while you were asleep?" Ben guessed. Zenitsu seemed to understand, nodding sheepishly. "It was impressive," Ben said, giving him a thumbs up. "Super fast." Zenitsu brightened at the praise, launching into what was obviously an explanation despite Ben not understanding a word. His animated gesture suggested he was describing some kind of training or technique. Ben nodded along, catching occasional words that sounded like thunder and breathing. Eventually, Zenitsu yawned widely and curled up to sleep, apparently having said whatever he needed to say. Ben glanced at the Omnitrix again, noticing how the red veins seemed to pulse with his heartbeat now. Whatever was happening to the device, it was progressing rapidly. He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him despite his concerns. His last conscious thought was a question: what new transformation would the Omnitrix offer him next? Morning arrived with a gentle nudge from Tanjiro. Ben blinked awake, finding the cave bathed in the soft light filtering through the waterfall. Nezuko was already secured in her box, and the others were preparing to depart. Tanjiro offered him some dried meat and rice balls, which Ben accepted gratefully. As they ate a quick breakfast, Tanjiro drew another map in the dirt, showing that they were now very close to their destination. "We'll reach the butterfly house today?" Ben asked, pointing to their destination. Tanjiro nodded, then drew a simple figure of a person, followed by what looked like a blade, then a question mark while looking at Ben. "You're asking if I want a sword of my own?" Ben interpreted. Another nod. Ben considered it. While the Omnitrix was his primary weapon, having a backup for when it timed out made sense. Plus, it might help him blend in better with the Demon Slayer Corps. Sure, he said with a shrug. Though I'll need a lot of practice. Tanjiro smiled approvingly, then erased his dirt drawing and stood. It was time to move on. They traveled through the morning, climbing higher into the mountains. The path grew steeper, occasionally requiring them to use their hands to scale particularly difficult sections. Ben was impressed by how easily the others navigated the terrain. Even Zenitsu, despite his complaints, moved with surprising agility. By midday, they reached a series of stone steps leading up through a bamboo forest. At the top, partially hidden among the trees, stood a large Japanese-style estate. Butterfly motifs adorned the gate and fence surrounding the property. "This is it?" Ben asked, taking in the peaceful setting. "Doesn't exactly scream demon hunting headquarters." Tanjiro led them through the gate, where they were immediately met by young women in butterfly-patterned kimonos. The women greeted Tanjiro with recognition, though they eyed the others, particularly Ben, with curiosity. One of the women spoke to Tanjiro at length. Though Ben couldn't understand the words, her tone and gestures suggested she was giving instructions. Tanjiro nodded repeatedly, occasionally glancing at Ben during the conversation. Finally, the woman bowed slightly and gestured for them to follow her. She led them through beautiful gardens to a large building at the center of the estate. Inside, they were shown to a spacious room with tatami floors and sliding paper doors. The woman indicated they should wait there and left, sliding the door closed behind her. "So now what?" Ben asked, settling cross-legged on the floor. Inosuke immediately sprawled out, apparently making himself at home. Zenitsu sat nervously, constantly glancing at the door. Tanjiro remained standing, his posture respectful as if expecting someone important. They didn't wait long. The door slid open again to reveal a young woman with pale skin and dark hair styled with butterfly ornaments. She wore a white and purple uniform similar to Tanjiro's but with a butterfly pattern. Despite her delicate appearance, her eyes were sharp and assessing as they swept over the group. Tanjiro bowed deeply. Zenitsu scrambled to do the same. Even Inosuke sat up, though he didn't bow. Ben, following their lead, gave a respectful nod. The woman spoke, her voice soft but authoritative. Tanjiro responded, gesturing to Ben several times during his explanation. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Ben, particularly the Omnitrix on his wrist. She approached Ben directly, saying something in Japanese. When Ben shook his head to indicate he didn't understand, she frowned thoughtfully. "Butterfly lady?" Ben tried, pointing to her. "You're in charge here." Tanjiro quickly said something that sounded like a correction, followed by what must have been a proper name, Shinobu Kocho. "Shinobu," Ben repeated with a nod. "Got it. I'm Ben. Ben Tennyson." Shinobu repeated his name carefully, then pointed to the Omnitrix with obvious interest. Ben held up his wrist. "The Omnitrix. It lets me transform." Shinobu said something to Tanjiro, who began a lengthy explanation, occasionally pausing to make transformation gestures or mimicking Ben's alien forms as best he could. Shinobu's expression grew increasingly intrigued. She spoke again, this time directly to Ben despite the language barrier, pointing to the Omnitrix and then making a demonstration gesture. "You want me to show you?" Ben guessed. Shinobu nodded, her smile pleasant but her eyes calculating. "All right," Ben said, standing up. "Let's take this outside, though. Some of my guys are pretty big." Tanjiro seemed to understand and translated. Shinobu nodded again, leading them back to the garden. Once outside, Ben activated the Omnitrix, scrolling through his available transformations. He selected one that would be impressive but not terrifying and pressed down the dial. The green-red light flashed, and where Ben had stood was now a tall, plant-like alien. But like his previous transformations, this swampfire was different. The plant matter of his body was darker, with red veins running throughout. The flames he could produce burned with the same crimson tinge as heat blasts had. "Swampfire," he announced, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. Shinobu's eyes widened slightly, the first real break in her composed demeanor. She approached cautiously, examining Swampfire with scientific interest. She said something to Tanjiro, who responded hesitantly. Swampfire stayed still, allowing Shinobu to circle him. When she completed her inspection, she spoke directly to him, gesturing to his hands. Understanding her interest, Swampfire produced a small flame in his palm. The fire burned with that strange crimson quality, dancing but contained. Shinobu leaned closer, studying the flame. She said something that made Tanjiro look surprised, then concerned. "What is it?" Swampfire asked, extinguishing the flame. "Something wrong." Tanjiro tried to explain through gestures, pointing to the flame, then to his own veins, then making a demon Fang gesture. "The flame has demon energy in it," Swampfire guessed. "Yeah, the Omnitrix has been adapting to this world's energy. Absorbing it somehow." Shinobu continued her questions, which Tanjiro translated through gestures. Swampfire did his best to explain the Omnitrix and its functions, demonstrating a few more abilities, regenerating a cut in his arm, growing vines from his body, producing more controlled flames. The demonstration ended when the Omnitrix timed out, returning Ben to human form. This transformation had drained him less than the previous ones, which he took as a good sign. Perhaps his body was adapting to the altered transformations. Shinobu spoke at length to Tanjiro, then bowed slightly to Ben before leading them back inside. This time, they were taken to a different building where a meal had been prepared. The butterfly-uniformed women gestured for them to sit and eat. "I could get used to this," Ben said appreciatively as he sampled the delicious food. After the meal, Tanjiro indicated they should follow him. He led Ben to yet another building, this one appearing to be a training dojo. Inside, racks of wooden practice swords lined the walls, and the floor was smooth hardwood perfect for training. Tanjiro selected a wooden sword and offered it to Ben, then took one for himself. He demonstrated a basic stance again, more formally this time, indicating Ben should copy him. For the next few hours, Tanjiro guided Ben through fundamental sword techniques. The language barrier actually helped in some ways. Without words to complicate things, Ben focused entirely on mimicking Tanjiro's movements and responding to his physical corrections. By the time they finished, Ben's arms ached and sweat soaked his borrowed clothes, but he felt he'd learned more than he expected. Tanjiro seemed pleased with his progress, offering an encouraging smile and pat on the shoulder. "Thanks for the lesson," Ben said, returning the wooden sword to its rack. "Though I'm definitely sticking to the Omnitrix for actual fighting." They returned to find Zenitsu and Inosuke engaged in their own training in the garden, supervised by some of Shinobu's assistants. Nezuko's box sat safely in the shade of a tree, undisturbed. As evening approached, Ben was shown to a room where he could bathe and change into fresh clothes provided by the estate. The hot water was a welcome relief for his sore muscles. When he emerged, dressed in a simple blue kimono, he found Tanjiro waiting with Shinobu. Both looked serious, and Tanjiro immediately gestured for Ben to follow them. They were led to what appeared to be Shinobu's private study, a room filled with books, scrolls, and strange glass containers holding various liquids. A large table dominated the center, covered with papers and open books. Shinobu spoke quietly to Tanjiro, who then turned to Ben and began a series of gestures. He pointed to the escaped demon from the previous night, then to the estate, then made a slashing motion across his throat. "The demon we fought was killed?" Ben asked. Tanjiro shook his head, then clarified by pointing to a different direction, then making a Fang gesture, followed by what looked like a crown or a high position. "It reported to someone powerful," Ben interpreted. "Their leader?" Tanjiro nodded grimly, then spoke the name, Muzan Kibutsuji. "Muzan," Ben repeated. "The big bad you mentioned before." Another nod. Shinobu unrolled a scroll on the table, revealing what appeared to be a hierarchy of demons. At the top was a single figure, presumably Muzan. Below were 12 positions, some filled with drawings of demons, others empty. The organization chart from hell, Ben commented. Literally. Tanjiro pointed to the top figure, then to Ben's Omnitrix, his expression deadly serious. Muzan knows about the Omnitrix now, Ben realized. And he wants it. Shinobu said something that sounded ominous, even without understanding the words. She pointed to several positions in the middle of the hierarchy. Tanjiro translated through gestures, demons of this rank were being sent to find Ben. Great, Ben sighed. I've been here less than a week and already made the most dangerous enemies possible. Shinobu spoke again, this time pointing to various locations on another scroll, a map. Tanjiro nodded along with her words, occasionally adding something. You're making plans, Ben guessed. Preparing for attacks. Tanjiro confirmed this with a nod, then pointed to Ben's chest and made a questioning gesture. Am I with you? Ben interpreted. Of course. I've never been one to run from a fight, especially when innocent people are in danger. Though they couldn't understand his words, both Tanjiro and Shinobu seemed to recognize his resolve. Shinobu smiled slightly and said something that made Tanjiro nod in agreement. The meeting continued as they worked out strategies through drawings and gestures. By the time they finished, night had fallen completely. Tanjiro led Ben back to their assigned sleeping quarters, where Zenitsu and Inosuke were already preparing for bed. Nezuko was out of her box, sitting quietly in a corner of the room. She perked up when Ben and Tanjiro entered, her unusual eyes following Ben with that same curiosity. As they settled down for the night, Ben found himself unable to sleep despite his physical exhaustion. The Omnitrix on his wrist continued to pulse with that strange red-green energy, occasionally cycling through alien silhouettes on its own as it had the previous night. Finally, Ben slipped outside to the garden, careful not to wake the others. The night was clear, stars shining brightly above the mountain estate. He sat on a stone bench, examining the Omnitrix more carefully. The device had always been partially sentient in some ways, adapting to threats, offering appropriate aliens for specific situations. But now it seemed to be developing in ways Ben had never seen before, integrating the demon energy of this world into its very core. A soft sound made Ben look up. Nezuko stood a few feet away, watching him. Without her brother or the others present, Ben realized this was the first time they'd been alone together. Hey, he said softly, gesturing to the space beside him on the bench. Nezuko approached cautiously, sitting down at a respectful distance. She pointed to the Omnitrix, then to herself, making the same comparison gesture she'd made before. You feel a connection to it, Ben guessed. Because of the demon energy. Nezuko nodded, her eyes reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural glow. Can you understand me at all? Ben asked, curious about her level of comprehension. Nezuko tilted her head, considering the question. She made a so gesture with her hand, suggesting she grasped some but not all of what he said. That's something, at least, Ben said with a small smile. Better than nothing. Nezuko reached out slowly, her hand hovering above the Omnitrix without touching it. The device responded, glowing more brightly and cycling through transformations faster. It reacts to you, Ben observed. I wonder. He activated the Omnitrix, scrolling through the aliens until he found the unfamiliar silhouette he'd noticed the previous night. Nezuko watched with fascination as Ben selected it and pressed down the dial. The transformation felt different immediately, less like changing into an alien and more like something awakening within him. The green-red light faded to reveal Ben in a form unlike any he'd had before. He was still humanoid, but taller and leaner. His skin was pale gray with red markings that resembled tribal patterns. His hands ended in sharp claws, and he could feel fangs in his mouth. Most strikingly, he had small horns protruding from his forehead and eyes that glowed with green-red energy. Whoa, he said, his voice deeper and slightly raspy. What am I? Nezuko's eyes widened in recognition. She pointed to herself, then to him, making a similar gesture. I'm like you, he realized. Some kind of demon form. The Omnitrix must have sampled demon DNA. He examined his new form, testing his limbs and senses. His hearing and smell were enhanced dramatically. He could hear heartbeats from inside the buildings and smell the distinct sense of everyone in the estate. His muscles felt dense with power, coiled and ready for explosive movement. Most importantly, he felt no loss of control or sudden bloodlust. Whatever this form was, it maintained his consciousness and morality intact. Let's call this one Bloodwrath, he decided, naming the new transformation. Nezuko made a small noise that might have been approval. She stood, gesturing for him to follow, and leaped effortlessly onto the roof of the nearest building. Bloodwrath followed, finding the jump ridiculously easy. They moved across the rooftops of the estate, Nezuko leading him away from the sleeping quarters toward the edge of the property. At the perimeter, she stopped, pointing out into the dark forest. Bloodwrath concentrated, using his enhanced senses to scan the trees. After a moment, he detected movement, something fast moving through the forest, then another, and another. Demons, he said, realizing what Nezuko had brought him to see. They're scouting the estate. Nezuko nodded, her expression serious despite the bamboo muzzle covering the lower half of her face. We should warn the others, Bloodwrath said, turning back toward the main buildings. Before they could move, a figure landed on the roof behind them, one of Shinobu's butterfly-uniformed assistants. The young woman stared at Bloodwrath with a mix of shock and battle readiness, her hand moving to a weapon at her side. Nezuko quickly stepped between them, making calming gestures and pointing to the Omnitrix symbol visible on Bloodwrath's chest. The woman's eyes widened in recognition, and she lowered her hand slightly, though she remained tense. She said something that sounded like a question. It's me, Ben, Bloodwrath said, pointing to the symbol. New transformation. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She spoke again, gesturing urgently toward the main building. I think she wants us to come with her, Bloodwrath interpreted. Probably to Shinobu. Nezuko nodded in agreement, and they followed the butterfly-uniformed woman back across the rooftops to a different building than they'd visited earlier. Inside, they found Shinobu already awake despite the late hour, examining scrolls by lamplight. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening slightly at Bloodwrath's appearance. She said something to her assistant, who quickly explained the situation. Shinobu approached Bloodwrath without fear, circling him as she had with Swampfire earlier. She touched his arm, examining the red markings with scientific interest, then pointed to his horns and claws with a questioning look. New transformation, Bloodwrath explained, pointing to the Omnitrix symbol. Demon DNA. Shinobu's expression grew serious. She spoke rapidly to her assistant, who hurried from the room. Then she gestured for Bloodwrath and Nezuko to follow her to a map spread across a table. Bloodwrath pointed to the forest surrounding the estate, then made circling motions to indicate the demons he'd sensed moving around the perimeter. Shinobu nodded grimly, apparently already aware of the threat. She indicated points around the property where butterfly-uniformed guards were stationed, then made a waiting gesture, followed by a sunrise motion. You're waiting until morning to deal with them? Bloodwrath guessed. Before Shinobu could respond, the door slid open and Tanjiro rushed in, followed by the assistant who had apparently fetched him. He stopped short at the sight of Bloodwrath, his hand instinctively moving to his sword. Nezuko quickly made calming gestures, pointing to the Omnitrix symbol on Bloodwrath's chest. Tanjiro's eyes widened in recognition, and he relaxed slightly, approaching with cautious curiosity. Ben? He asked, studying the demonic transformation. Yeah, it's me, Bloodwrath confirmed. New form. Apparently the Omnitrix sampled demon DNA. Tanjiro circled him slowly, much as Shinobu had done. His expression was a complex mix of concern, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. Shinobu spoke to Tanjiro, gesturing to the map. He nodded, his expression turning serious as he understood the situation. He said something to Bloodwrath, pointing to the forest and then to the Omnitrix symbol. "You want to know if I sense the demons out there?" Bloodwrath guessed. Tanjiro nodded. "Yeah," Bloodwrath confirmed. "At least 3, maybe more. Moving around the perimeter like they're scouting." Tanjiro relayed this to Shinobu, who nodded thoughtfully. She spoke at length, occasionally pointing to different areas of the map. Tanjiro listened intently, occasionally asking questions. Finally, Tanjiro turned to Bloodwrath and Nezuko. He made a series of gestures indicating they should return to the sleeping quarters and wait until morning. "No midnight demon hunting?" Bloodwrath interpreted. "Fair enough. Safety in numbers, I guess." As if on cue, the Omnitrix symbol began beeping, signaling the end of the transformation. In a flash of green-red light, Bloodwrath reverted to Ben. The sudden loss of the demonic form's enhanced senses made the world seem duller, quieter. Ben staggered slightly, the transformation drain hitting him harder than usual. Tanjiro steadied him with a concerned expression, saying something questioning. "I'm okay," Ben assured him. "Just, that form takes a lot out of me." Tanjiro nodded in understanding, then gestured for them to leave. They bid goodnight to Shinobu and followed Tanjiro back to their sleeping quarters, where Inosuke and Zenitsu remained soundly asleep, unaware of the night's developments. As Ben settled back into his bedroll, he noticed Tanjiro watching him with a thoughtful expression. The young demon slayer seemed to be reassessing Ben in light of the new transformation. "Don't worry," Ben said quietly. "I'm still me, no matter what form I take." Though Tanjiro couldn't understand the words, he seemed to grasp the sentiment. He nodded once, a gesture of trust, before returning to his own bedroll. Sleep claimed Ben quickly this time, his body exhausted from the new transformation. His dreams were vivid, flashes of red eyes watching from darkness, a pale hand reaching for the Omnitrix, and a voice that somehow reached beyond language barriers to whisper directly into his mind, "Soon." Morning arrived with urgent activity. Ben awoke to find the others already dressed and preparing weapons. Tanjiro handed him a real sword, simple but well crafted, with a green-wrapped hilt that matched the color of the Omnitrix. "For me?" Ben asked, surprised by the gift. Tanjiro nodded, demonstrating briefly how to wear it properly at his side. The sword was lighter than Ben expected, balanced for quick drawing. "Thanks," he said, securing it to his borrowed uniform. Tanjiro had also provided clothing similar to what the demon slayers wore, a dark uniform with a green-patterned Haori jacket. Once dressed, they joined the others in the main courtyard. Shinobu stood addressing a gathered group of demon slayers, some in butterfly uniforms, others in various styles but all carrying swords. Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke took positions among them, and Ben followed suit. Though he couldn't understand Shinobu's words, her tone made the seriousness of the situation clear. She gestured to the surrounding forest, then formed teams with precise hand movements. Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke were grouped together, with Ben indicated to join them. "We're going demon hunting," Ben guessed as they moved to the estate's gate. Tanjiro nodded grimly, pointing to the forest and making a sweeping gesture. "Clearing them out before they can attack," Ben interpreted. Another nod. Tanjiro indicated Nezuko's box on his back, then made a protective gesture around it. "Don't worry," Ben assured him. "I'll help keep her safe too." As the gates opened, the Demon Slayer teams dispersed in different directions. Tanjiro led their group north, moving quickly but quietly through the trees. After about 20 minutes of travel, he stopped, lifting his nose to scent the air. His expression sharpened, and he drew his sword in a fluid motion. Zenitsu and Inosuke followed suit, all three suddenly alert to a threat Ben couldn't detect. Then he heard it, a rustle of movement too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. Something was circling them. "How many?" Ben whispered, hand hovering near the Omnitrix. Tanjiro held up 3 fingers, then indicated their positions with subtle head movements, one ahead, one to the right, one behind. "Surrounding us," Ben muttered. Classic. The first attack came without warning, a blur of movement that Inosuke intercepted with astonishing speed, his dual swords catching what appeared to be razor-sharp tendrils aimed at Tanjiro's back. The forest exploded into action. Tanjiro leaped forward to engage the demon ahead, his water-like sword techniques flowing around the creature's defenses. Zenitsu, despite his initial terrified squeak, held his ground against the third demon that emerged from the trees to their right. Ben activated the Omnitrix, scrolling quickly through his options. He selected Diamond Head again, curious to see how the transformation had evolved since the first time. The green-red light flashed, and Diamond Head emerged, but the changes were even more pronounced now. The red veins throughout his crystalline body pulsed with energy, and the crystals themselves had a sharper, more organic quality. Most strikingly, the usual diamond spikes on his back had elongated into something resembling horns or blades. "Whoa," Diamond Head said, examining his altered form. "This is getting intense." The demon Inosuke fought turned at the flash of light, its attention diverted by Diamond Head's transformation. It said something in Japanese that sounded like surprise mixed with hunger. "Eyes on your opponent, pal," Diamond Head called, forming crystal shards in his hands. The demon was humanoid but with a grotesque twist, its body covered in what looked like tree bark, with branches extending from its back that ended in sharp, claw-like thorns. These were the tendrils that had attacked earlier. Inosuke shouted something that sounded like a challenge, clearly annoyed at the demon's diverted attention. He launched himself back into the fray, his wild fighting style a stark contrast to Tanjiro's precise techniques. Diamond Head joined the battle, firing crystal shards infused with the red energy. When they struck the tree demon, they didn't just embed themselves as normal crystals would, they seemed to burn into the bark, preventing regeneration around the wounds. The demon shrieked, focusing fully on Diamond Head now. Its branch tendrils whipped toward him with frightening speed, but Diamond Head created a crystal shield that caught the attack. On contact, his crystals began spreading onto the branches, traveling up toward the demon's body. The creature tried to pull away, but the crystallization continued. Remembering the technique from his previous Diamond Head transformation, Ben pressed the advantage, charging forward to make direct contact with the demon's main body. The moment his hand touched the tree-like flesh, the crystallization accelerated dramatically. The demon screamed as its entire form began transforming into the same red-veined crystal as Diamond Head's body. Inosuke watched in fascination for a moment, then apparently decided to finish the job. With a wild cry, he leaped high and brought both swords down on the crystallized demon's neck, shattering it completely. Instead of turning to ash, the demon shattered like glass, the fragments dissolving into nothing. "That's new," Diamond Head commented. Across the clearing, Tanjiro had nearly finished his opponent, a wolf-like demon that moved with incredible agility but couldn't match Tanjiro's breathing technique and sword skills. With a final precise strike, he separated the demon's head from its body, both turning to ash. Zenitsu, meanwhile, was struggling. His opponent, a female demon with butterfly-like wings that seemed a mockery of Shinobu's insignia, moved too quickly for him to land a solid blow. She darted around him, inflicting small cuts with razor-sharp fingernails while staying just beyond his sword's reach. "Hang on, Zenitsu," Diamond Head called, rushing to help. The butterfly demon saw him coming and changed tactics, flying higher among the trees. From this vantage point, she launched what looked like crystalline scales from her wings, hundreds of them raining down on both Zenitsu and Diamond Head. Diamond Head created another crystal shield, covering both himself and Zenitsu. The scales struck the shield with surprising force, embedding themselves deeply. "These aren't ordinary demons," Diamond Head observed as the barrage continued. "They're stronger, more coordinated." Zenitsu said something that sounded frantic, pointing up at the demon and then at his own sword with a helpless gesture. "She's out of reach," Diamond Head understood. "I can fix that." He formed his hand into a platform and gestured for Zenitsu to step on it. The blond boy understood immediately, placing one foot on Diamond Head's hand. With a powerful thrust, Diamond Head launched Zenitsu upward toward the butterfly demon. Zenitsu's expression shifted mid-air from terror to deadly focus. Lightning seemed to crackle around his blade as he executed a perfect strike that caught the demon by surprise, severing one of her wings. The butterfly demon shrieked, spiraling down to the forest floor. Before she could recover, Tanjiro was there, his sword flashing in a water-like pattern that ended with decapitation. As the demon dissolved to ash, silence returned to the forest. Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke regrouped, all breathing heavily but looking uninjured beyond minor cuts. "Everyone okay?" Diamond Head asked. Tanjiro nodded, then pointed to Diamond Head's crystalline form with raised eyebrows, clearly noting the changes. "Yeah, the transformations keep evolving," Diamond Head explained, examining his altered body. "Getting stronger, but also, different." Tanjiro seemed about to respond when his head suddenly snapped up, his expression alarmed. He shouted something to the others, grabbing Nezuko's box protectively. A moment later, Diamond Head sensed it too, a presence far more powerful than the demons they'd just defeated. The very air seemed to grow heavy, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. From the shadows stepped a figure that made even Inosuke take a defensive stance. The newcomer appeared to be a young woman in an elegant kimono, her beauty flawless but with an uncanny quality that betrayed her demonic nature. Her eyes glowed red, and when she smiled, sharp fangs glinted in the dappled forest light. She spoke, her voice melodious but cold. Though Ben couldn't understand her words, her attention was clearly fixed on him, or rather, on the Omnitrix symbol on his chest. Tanjiro stepped forward, placing himself between the Demoness and Diamond Head. He said something that sounded like a warning or challenge. The Demoness laughed, a sound like breaking glass. She replied, gesturing dismissively at Tanjiro before pointing directly at Diamond Head. "I'm guessing she's here for me," Diamond Head said. "Or more specifically, for this." He tapped the Omnitrix symbol. The Demoness smiled wider at his words, as if confirming his guess despite the language barrier. She spoke again, this time making a deferential gesture and saying a name Ben recognized, Muzan-sama. Sent by the big boss himself, Diamond Head interpreted. "I'm flattered." Tanjiro said something urgent to Zenitsu and Inosuke, who moved to flanking positions, surrounding the Demoness. She watched them with amused disinterest, clearly not considering them serious threats. When she moved, it was with frightening speed, not toward any of the demon slayers, but directly at Diamond Head. Her hands transformed in mid-leap, fingers extending into blade-like claws that glowed with a dark energy. Diamond Head barely had time to create a crystal barrier before she struck. The impact shattered his defense completely, something that had never happened before with ordinary opponents. The force sent him sliding backward, crystal feet digging furrows in the forest floor. "Okay, you're definitely not an ordinary demon," Diamond Head grunted, reforming his arms into blades. The Demoness smiled, saying something that sounded like an agreement. She glanced at the fractured crystals from Diamond Head's broken shield, her expression calculating. Then she did something unexpected, she picked up a fragment and put it in her mouth, swallowing it. "That can't be good," Diamond Head muttered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then red veins similar to those in Diamond Head's body began spreading across the Demoness' skin. Her smile widened as she held up her hands, watching as they partially crystallized, taking on properties similar to Diamond Head's form. "She's absorbing my powers," Diamond Head realized with alarm. Tanjiro shouted in warning, then charged the Demoness, his sword techniques flowing like water. Inosuke joined the attack from the opposite direction, while Zenitsu circled to a flanking position. The Demoness moved with impossible grace, evading their coordinated assault while her partially crystallized hands deflected sword strikes that should have cut through flesh. She laughed as she fought, clearly enjoying the battle. Diamond Head rejoined the fray, firing crystal shards that the Demoness either dodged or caught in her crystallized hands. When one shard did strike her shoulder, It embedded itself but didn't cause the burning effect that had worked on the previous demons. She's immune, Diamond Head realized. Because she absorbed my power. The battle intensified as the demoness went on the offensive, her movements becoming faster and more aggressive. She landed a powerful blow on Inusuke that sent him crashing through a tree trunk. Zenitsu barely avoided a strike that would have taken his head, the claw-like fingers cutting through his sleeve and drawing blood. Tanjiro maintained his defense, his breathing technique visibly intensifying as his sword movements became even more precise. He managed to score a cut along the demoness' arm, but instead of blood, crystalline fragments erupted from the wound, immediately healing it. "We need a different approach," Diamond Head said, touching the Omnitrix symbol on his chest. "Let's try something she can't absorb." In a flash of green-red light, Diamond Head transformed into Bloodwrath, the demon form that had manifested the previous night. The transition felt smoother this time, as if this form was becoming more natural for the Omnitrix. The demoness paused, genuine surprise crossing her perfect features. She spoke, her tone questioning as she studied Bloodwrath's demonic appearance. "Sorry, still don't speak the language," Bloodwrath said, testing his claws. "But I'm guessing you're wondering what kind of demon I am." The answer? The kind that kicks other demons' butts. Though she couldn't understand his words, the demoness clearly understood the challenge. Her expression shifted from surprise to interest, then to predatory focus. She said something that sounded like a command or demand, gesturing to the Omnitrix symbol on Bloodwrath's chest. "Not for sale," Bloodwrath replied, dropping into a fighting stance. The demoness attacked, her crystallized hand slashing toward Bloodwrath's throat. He dodged with the enhanced speed of his demonic form, counterattacking with his own claws. The strike connected, drawing actual blood this time instead of crystal shards. The demoness hissed in pain and surprise, leaping back to reassess. The wound on her cheek healed quickly, but not instantly as the previous one had. She spoke again, her tone now more cautious, almost respectful. Tanjiro moved to Bloodwrath's side, saying something urgent while gesturing to the demoness' neck. "Still gotta go for the neck, got it," Bloodwrath nodded. Working together, they pressed their advantage. Bloodwrath's demonic speed and strength complemented Tanjiro's sword techniques perfectly. Zenitsu recovered enough to rejoin the fight, his lightning-fast strikes forcing the demoness to constantly divide her attention. Even Inusuke returned, bloodied but unbowed, his wild dual sword style adding to the pressure. The demoness began to show signs of strain, her movements becoming more defensive as she struggled to counter attacks from multiple directions. When Bloodwrath managed to land a solid blow to her midsection, she staggered backward, blood flowing freely from a wound that healed much slower than before. Her expression shifted from confidence to calculation. She spoke again, this time in a tone that sounded almost like a farewell. Before anyone could react, she flung something to the ground that exploded in a cloud of blinding smoke. When the air cleared, she was gone. She retreated, Bloodwrath observed, scanning the forest with his enhanced senses. Smart move on her part. Tanjiro sheathed his sword, his expression troubled. He said something to the others, who nodded grimly. "I'm guessing this isn't over," Bloodwrath said. Tanjiro confirmed with a nod, pointing in the direction of the butterfly estate, then making a hurrying gesture. "We need to get back and report," Bloodwrath interpreted. As they made their way back toward the estate, the Omnitrix symbol began beeping, signaling the end of the transformation. Bloodwrath reverted to Ben, the sudden loss of demonic strength making him stagger slightly. Zenitsu caught his arm, steadying him. The blonde boy said something that, despite the language barrier, sounded concerned. "Thanks," Ben said, straightening up. "I'm good. These transformations just take a lot out of me." By the time they reached the butterfly estate, other Demon Slayer teams had returned as well. Some looked wounded but victorious, while others appeared shaken by their encounters. Shinobu stood in the courtyard, listening to reports and directing the injured to medical buildings. When she saw Ben's group, she approached quickly, her eyes scanning them for injuries. Tanjiro immediately began explaining what had happened, his gestures indicating the powerful demoness they'd encountered and her unusual abilities. Shinobu's expression grew increasingly serious as she listened. When Tanjiro mentioned the demoness absorbing Diamond Head's powers, she glanced sharply at Ben, saying something that sounded questioning. "Yeah, she ate a piece of my crystal and gained similar powers," Ben confirmed, mimicking the action. "First time that's happened." Shinobu spoke at length, her usual serene expression replaced by grave concern. Though Ben couldn't understand her words, the message was clear: this development was dangerous. They were escorted to a building Ben hadn't visited before, a war room of sorts, with maps covering the walls and a large table in the center. Several other demon slayers were already gathered, including some who appeared to be higher ranking based on the deference shown to them. For the next hour, Ben watched as Tanjiro and the others reported their encounter in detail. Shinobu occasionally asked questions, while the other demon slayers listened intently. Ben wished desperately that he could understand what was being said. Clearly important strategies were being discussed. Finally, one of the senior demon slayers approached Ben directly. He was an imposing man with scars across his face and a serious demeanor. He pointed to the Omnitrix, saying something questioning. "The Omnitrix," Ben explained, holding up his wrist. "It lets me transform." The man nodded, then made a gesture mimicking transformation, followed by a questioning look. "You want to see another demonstration?" Ben guessed. The man nodded again. "Let me try something that hasn't been affected by demon energy yet," Ben said, activating the Omnitrix. He scrolled through the available transformations, selecting one he hadn't used since arriving in this world. He pressed down the dial, hoping this form would remain closer to its original version. The green-red light flashed, and Ben transformed into Echo Echo, but like all his previous transformations, this one had changed as well. The usually white silicon body now had red veins running throughout, and the sound holes on his face glowed with crimson energy. "Echo Echo," he announced, his voice carrying the same mechanical quality but with an eerie harmonic undertone. The senior demon slayers studied him with obvious interest. One of them said something to Shinobu, who replied while gesturing to the Omnitrix symbol. Echo Echo demonstrated his sonic powers, creating sound waves that vibrated the air visibly. The demon slayers watched attentively, some taking notes or discussing among themselves. When the demonstration ended and Echo Echo reverted to Ben, the meeting continued with renewed intensity. Maps were consulted, plans drawn, and what appeared to be assignments distributed. Finally, Shinobu approached Ben with Tanjiro. Through Tanjiro's gestures, Ben understood that they would be remaining at the butterfly estate for the time being. The powerful demoness who had escaped would undoubtedly report to Muzan, and they needed to prepare for what would come next. As they left the war room, Ben found himself conflicted. He was helping these people fight their battles, forming bonds with Tanjiro and the others, but he was also no closer to finding a way home. The Omnitrix continued to adapt to this world's energy, changing in ways he didn't fully understand. Tanjiro seemed to sense his troubled thoughts. He placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, saying something in a reassuring tone. "Thanks," Ben replied with a small smile. "I appreciate it, even if I don't understand the words." They returned to the training dojo, where Tanjiro immediately began practicing sword techniques with renewed intensity. Ben watched for a while, then activated the Omnitrix again, scrolling through the available transformations. The device still showed his usual aliens, but many of the silhouettes had subtle differences now, horns, claws, or other demonic features added to their familiar shapes. And there, among them, was the silhouette of Bloodwrath, the pure demon form the Omnitrix had created. "You're really embracing this world's energy," Ben murmured to the device. "But what happens when it's time to go home? Will you go back to normal, or is this change permanent?" The Omnitrix, as usual, offered no answers. But as Ben deactivated it, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A tiny symbol had appeared beside the activation button, a mark that looked disturbingly like the kanji for blood that he'd seen in some of Shinobu's scrolls. That night, as Ben prepared for bed in the room assigned to him and the others, Tanjiro approached with something in his hands, a small book and writing implements. "What's this?" Ben asked as Tanjiro offered them to him. Tanjiro mimed writing, then pointed to Ben, then to himself. He wrote something in the book, then pointed to the word and said it aloud, "Sword." "You want to teach me Japanese," Ben realized. "So we can actually talk to each other." Tanjiro nodded enthusiastically. "That's actually a great idea," Ben said, taking the book and brush. "Though I've never been the best student." For the next hour, they worked together, Tanjiro writing basic words and teaching Ben to pronounce them, Ben awkwardly attempting to replicate the unfamiliar characters. By the time they finished, Ben had learned perhaps 20 simple words: sword, demon, water, fire, friend, enemy, run, fight, and other basics useful for their situation. "Thanks," Ben said in Japanese, one of the words he'd just learned. Tanjiro beamed with obvious pleasure at Ben's progress. He said something longer that Ben couldn't fully understand, but the sentiment was clear: they were friends now, working together despite the strange circumstances that had brought them together. As they settled down to sleep, Ben felt more optimistic than he had since arriving in this world. The language lessons were a tangible step forward, a way to bridge the gap between himself and these people who had taken him in. The Omnitrix might be changing, adapting to this world in unpredictable ways. Muzan and his powerful demons might be targeting him. He was still stranded far from home with no clear way back. But he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Outside the butterfly estate, in the darkness of the surrounding forest, the elegant demoness knelt before a shadowy figure. She spoke softly, her head bowed in deference. "The boy's power is unlike anything I've seen, Muzan-sama. When I absorbed a fragment of his crystal form, I gained similar abilities, but they were imperfect, temporary." The shadowy figure remained silent, listening. Most intriguing was his transformation into a demon-like form, not a true demon, but something with our strength and speed. The device on his wrist controls these changes. The shadow shifted slightly, revealing pale hands with unnaturally long fingernails. "Yes, Muzan-sama. I believe the device is absorbing and adapting to our blood's power. With each transformation, it grows stronger, more attuned to our essence." The pale hands flexed, then relaxed. "I understand, Muzan-sama. I will gather the others. The boy must be captured alive, the device intact." As the demoness rose and departed, the shadowy figure remained motionless, contemplating. Then, in perfect Japanese, it spoke to the empty air: "A power that transforms, that adapts and evolves, how fascinating. Perhaps what I've sought has finally arrived, from beyond our world." Morning broke over the butterfly estate with the sound of intense training. Ben awoke to find the others already gone, their bedrolls empty. Following the sounds of combat, he discovered a larger training ground behind the main dojo where Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke were engaged in practice fights with other demon slayers. Ben watched from the sidelines, impressed by the speed and precision of their movements. Without the immediate threat of demon attacks, he could appreciate the skill involved in their swordsmanship more fully. Shinobu approached, saying something in greeting. Ben recognized a few words from Tanjiro's lessons the previous night. "Good morning," he replied in careful Japanese, one of the phrases he'd learned. Shinobu's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, and she smiled approvingly. She said something else, gesturing to the training ground, then to Ben. "You want me to join?" he guessed, mimicking a sword motion. Shinobu nodded, then made a transformation gesture, pointing to the Omnitrix. "Or use this," Ben understood. "Training with my transformations." Another nod. She led him to a separate area of the grounds where several wooden dummies were set up. She demonstrated attacking one, her movements blindingly fast despite her small stature. "My turn?" Ben asked, activating the Omnitrix. He scrolled through his options, selecting a form that might benefit from combat training rather than one that relied purely on raw power. The green-red light flashed, and he transformed into a modified version of XLR-8, the velociraptor-like alien now sporting small horns and red-veined skin beneath his black and blue exterior. XLR-8, he announced, feeling the familiar rush of speed but with a new edge to it, a predatory instinct that hadn't been there before. Shinobu studied his form with scientific interest, then gestured for him to attack the dummy. XLR-8 obliged, charging at high speed and delivering a series of rapid strikes. The dummy shuddered under the impact but remained standing. Shinobu made a slowing motion with her hands, then demonstrated a more precise strike to a specific point on the dummy's neck. She was teaching him to target weak points rather than rely on raw speed and power. XLR-8 tried again, focusing his attacks as Shinobu had shown. This time, his claws struck the dummy's neck with precision, and the head separated cleanly from the body. Shinobu nodded approvingly, then gestured for him to continue with the other dummies. For the next hour, XLR-8 practiced targeting specific vulnerabilities, gradually improving his precision. When the Omnitrix timed out, Ben took a break, drinking water provided by one of the butterfly-uniformed attendants. Tanjiro joined him, looking tired but satisfied from his own training. "Good morning," Ben said in Japanese. Tanjiro grinned widely at Ben's use of his language. He replied with a simple phrase that Ben recognized as, "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," Ben answered, one of the basic responses he'd learned. His vocabulary was extremely limited, but even these small exchanges felt like significant progress. Tanjiro began teaching him more words, pointing to objects around them and naming them. Ben repeated each word, trying to commit them to memory. The language lesson continued through breakfast, with Zenitsu occasionally correcting Ben's pronunciation and Inosuke deliberately teaching him what were probably rude phrases, based on Tanjiro's disapproving reactions. After breakfast, Shinobu summoned them to the war room again. The atmosphere was tense, with more demon slayers gathered than the previous day. Maps had been updated with new markings, and scrolls covered the central table. Through Tanjiro's limited translations and gestures, Ben gathered that multiple demon attacks had occurred overnight in villages surrounding the butterfly estate. The pattern suggested coordination, a strategic encirclement rather than random violence. "Muzan," Ben said, recognizing the name when it was spoken. Shinobu nodded grimly, pointing to the map pattern, then to Ben's Omnitrix. "He's coming for this," Ben understood. "Using these attacks as a distraction or to wear us down." The meeting continued, with plans made and assignments distributed. When it concluded, Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke were tasked with investigating one of the attacked villages to the east. Ben would accompany them, with additional demon slayers assigned to other locations. As they prepared to depart, Shinobu approached Ben with a small wooden box. She opened it to reveal what appeared to be a simple cord necklace with a butterfly charm. "For me?" Ben asked, surprised by the gift. Shinobu nodded, pointing to the charm and then making a demon gesture, followed by a warning motion. "It detects demons." Ben guessed. She shook her head, then pointed to Ben's throat and made a talking gesture, followed by pointing to her own ear. "It helps you understand me?" Ben tried, hope rising. Shinobu's expression indicated he was close. She demonstrated by placing the necklace around her own neck, saying something in Japanese, then removing it and speaking again, this time gesturing as if her words were reaching farther. "It amplifies sound," Ben realized. "So you can hear me from a distance?" Shinobu nodded, looking pleased at his understanding. She handed him the necklace, which he promptly put on. The charm felt cool against his skin, with a subtle vibration that suggested it contained more than mere decoration. With preparations complete, they departed the butterfly estate, heading east toward the village that had reported demon attacks. The journey would take several hours, leading them through forests and mountains similar to those they traversed to reach the estate. As they walked, Tanjiro continued Ben's language lessons, teaching him phrases that might be useful in the coming investigation, questions about what happened, words for injuries or deaths, terms to describe different types of demons. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the village. Smoke still rose from several buildings, and an unnatural silence hung over the area. Tanjiro signaled for caution as they entered, swords ready. The destruction was worse than Ben had expected. Houses lay in splintered ruins, fields were trampled, and bloodstains darkened the ground in many places. But most disturbing was the absence of bodies. No villagers, dead or alive, remained. "Where is everyone?" Ben asked, the question understandable despite the language barrier. Tanjiro's expression was grim as he examined bloodstains and footprints. He said something to the others, pointing to drag marks leading into the forest. They were taken, Ben realized with horror. Not killed, but captured. Tanjiro nodded solemnly, then knelt to examine the ground more closely. He inhaled deeply, his unique sense of smell providing information the others couldn't detect. After a moment, he stood, pointing decisively toward the mountains to the north. He said something to the group, his tone urgent. "The demons took them that way?" Ben guessed. Tanjiro confirmed with a nod, then made a gesture suggesting large numbers. "Many demons," Ben interpreted. "Or many captives. Or both." Another nod, more grave this time. Tanjiro spoke to Zenitsu and Inosuke, clearly outlining a plan. They would follow the trail, but cautiously. This was unlike normal demon behavior and suggested a trap. Ben activated the Omnitrix, scrolling through his options. "I should transform now, before we walk into whatever's waiting for us." He selected Blood Wrath, pressing down the dial. The transformation felt even more natural this time, the demonic form integrating smoothly with his consciousness. "My senses are better in this form," Blood Wrath explained, scanning the forest ahead. "I might pick up things even Tanjiro can't smell." Tanjiro nodded in agreement, adjusting Nezuko's box on his back before leading them into the forest. They moved in formation, Tanjiro in front, Inosuke and Zenitsu flanking, Bloodwrath bringing up the rear with his enhanced senses alert for ambushes. The trail led steadily upward, deeper into the mountains. Occasionally they found signs of the captives, torn clothing, bloodstains, footprints showing people being dragged or forced to walk. The implications were disturbing. Demons typically killed and ate humans immediately, rarely taking prisoners. After an hour of tracking, Tanjiro halted suddenly, signaling for silence. Bloodwrath focused his senses, detecting what had alarmed the demon slayer, voices ahead, speaking in Japanese. Many voices, some human, some with the distinctive harmonic quality he now recognized as demonic. They advanced more cautiously, eventually reaching a vantage point overlooking a disturbing scene. In a natural clearing between rocky outcroppings, dozens of villagers were gathered, alive but restrained with strange organic-looking bonds. Surrounding them were at least 10 demons of varying appearances, all watching the humans with hungry eyes but making no move to attack them. At the center of the clearing stood the elegant demoness from their previous encounter. She appeared to be giving instructions to the other demons while examining each human captive briefly. "They're selecting them for something," Bloodwrath whispered. "But what?" Tanjiro's expression was one of focused rage. He whispered something to the others, gesturing to different positions around the clearing. They would surround the demons before attacking, maximizing the element of surprise. As the others moved into position, Bloodwrath studied the situation more carefully. The demoness was systematically dividing the humans into groups, children in one area, young adults in another, older villagers in a third. Some selection process was clearly underway. When everyone was in position, Tanjiro gave the signal, a bird call that sounded perfectly natural but carried meaning to the group. They attacked simultaneously from multiple directions. Tanjiro struck first, his water-breathing technique flowing around the nearest demon's defenses and decapitating it before the others realized what was happening. Inosuke burst from the underbrush with a wild roar, his dual swords cutting down 2 more demons who turned too slowly to defend themselves. Zenitsu moved like lightning, eliminating another demon that was guarding the children. Bloodwrath charged directly at the elegant demoness, recognizing her as the greatest threat. She saw him coming, her perfect features twisting in a snarl as she leapt to meet his attack. "We meet again," she said in accented English, surprising Bloodwrath completely. "You speak my language," he replied, claws clashing with hers in a shower of sparks. "I learned," she smiled cruelly. "Muzan-sama wishes to understand you better before he takes your power." They separated, circling each other while the battle raged around them. The other demons had recovered from the initial surprise and were now fighting back fiercely. Despite several being killed in the first assault, the remainder proved more dangerous than ordinary demons. These were coordinated, trained, using actual fighting techniques rather than relying on brute strength. "What's the plan here?" Bloodwrath asked, dodging a lightning-fast strike from the Demoness. "Kidnapping villagers isn't your usual style, from what I hear." "Bait," she replied simply, her smile widening. "And test subjects." She gestured to the divided groups of humans. "Some to lure you here. Others to receive a special gift, blood infused with energy from fragments of your transformations." Bloodwrath's eyes widened in horror. "You're experimenting on them? Trying to create hybrids?" "Precisely," the Demoness confirmed. "Demons with alien abilities. The results have been messy so far. But we're learning." Rage flooded through Bloodwrath, his demonic form responding to the emotion with increased power. Red energy crackled around his claws as he charged the Demoness again, moving faster than before. She barely evaded his attack, a look of surprise crossing her features as his claws grazed her cheek, drawing blood that didn't immediately heal. "Interesting," she observed, touching the wound. "Your demon form grows stronger with your emotions. Muzan-sama will be pleased to learn this." Around the clearing, the battle had turned chaotic. Tanjiro fought 3 demons simultaneously, his water-breathing techniques keeping them at bay but unable to land a killing blow. Inosuke was wounded but still fighting ferociously, while Zenitsu had positioned himself protectively before the children, his sword flashing whenever a demon approached. "This ends now," Bloodwrath growled, the Omnitrix symbol on his chest pulsing with intense energy. "These people aren't your test subjects." He touched the symbol, triggering a transformation within a transformation, something he'd rarely attempted before. Green-red light flashed, and where Bloodwrath had stood was now a fusion form, Heatblast's body but with Bloodwrath's demonic features, flames burning blood-red instead of orange. Bloodfire, he named this new fusion, feeling the immense power coursing through him. The elegant Demoness actually took a step back, her confident expression faltering. "What are you?" she whispered. "Your worst nightmare," Bloodfire replied, launching a stream of blood-red flames that moved like living tendrils, seeking the Demoness with unnatural precision. She dodged desperately, but the flames followed, catching her kimono sleeve and burning through it instantly. Where the flames touched her skin, they left black marks that didn't heal, as if cauterizing her regenerative ability. The Demoness shrieked in genuine fear, retreating toward the edge of the clearing. She barked orders to the remaining demons, who immediately disengaged from their fights and moved to surround her protectively. Bloodfire advanced, red flames dancing around him in patterns that resembled demonic script. The very ground smoldered beneath his feet, and the air shimmered with heat. "Release the villagers," he demanded, "or I'll show you exactly what happens when alien tech meets demon energy." The Demoness hesitated, calculating her options. Then, with obvious reluctance, she gestured to the demons guarding the human captives. They stepped away, though their hungry eyes never left the potential meals. "This isn't over," the Demoness said, her beauty marred by the black burn on her arm that refused to heal. "Muzan-sama will have your power, one way or another. Tell Muzan he's welcome to try," Bloodfire replied. "But he should know, I've faced worse than him in my world, and I'm still standing." The Demoness smiled coldly. "You know nothing of Muzan-sama's power. But you will learn." She made a cutting gesture, and the demons surrounding her threw something to the ground that exploded in blinding light rather than smoke. When visibility returned, they were gone, vanished into the forest with unnatural speed. Bloodfire immediately moved to help free the captives, his flames reducing the organic bonds to ash without harming the humans within. Though terrified by his appearance, the villagers soon realized he was helping them and stopped struggling. Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and Inosuke joined in freeing the captives, checking them for injuries and offering reassurances in Japanese. Bloodfire noticed Tanjiro examining the freed villagers with particular attention, occasionally sniffing the air around them with a concerned expression. When they had released everyone, Tanjiro approached Bloodfire, speaking urgently while pointing to several of the younger villagers. "You think they've already been experimented on?" Bloodfire guessed, the horror of the situation. Something went wrong with this response. Please try again. Continue the book with its next chapter. The end. Thank you for watching this video. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video.